now just switching gears slightly from flies and fish and mice into humans. And I'm going to be talking about how sleep is regulated by the circadian timing system. Okay, there we go. So as you've heard a little bit in some of the previous talks, there are two systems that are actually regulating sleep, and those are the circadian timing system, which generates these near 24-hour rhythms in sleepiness and alertness, and then this process called the sleep-wake homeostat, which is the idea that the longer that you're awake, you are building up more and more sleepiness. And then when you go to sleep, you dissipate that sleepiness. And if you sleep long enough and well enough, you'll start out the next day at a very low level of sleep pressure, and then again start to build it up. Now, as you'll hear potentially from some of the other speakers, these circadian or biological clocks are innate properties of most of the organisms that we've looked for them in. And we think they exist because life evolved on this very periodic planet with very strong cycles in the environment. Cycles of light and darkness, which then lead to cycles in temperature and humidity and other things. And that if, as an organism, you're able to know when those strong changes are coming and be prepared for them in advance, you will have you'll have better outcomes. So if you know, for example, that it's about to become light out and you're a day active species, and that's when you need to go out and start looking for food, and you're awake and ready to do that when daylight happens, you're going to have an adaptive advantage. And that's been shown that these clocks do provide an adaptive advantage in a number of different organisms, and I particularly like the study that was done in this small mammal, where Patricia DeCourcy went out and captured a bunch of these wild ground squirrels. She then brought them into the lab, and in some of them she lesioned their major circadian pacemaker in the SCN. She did some surgical controls and then had some intact controls. And then she put radio trackers on them once they had recovered from the surgery, released them back into the wild, and then she tracked them over the entire next season. And what she found is that the animals with the intact circadian system had a much better survival rate. And in particular, of the animals that didn't survive, many of them were they didn't survive because they were outside of their burrows at night, and so the predators then got them. And even ones who weren't necessarily outside their burrows at night, she found that in a lot of cases, rather than being quiet and inactive in their burrows, they were in their burrows, but they were making a lot of noise and being active. And again, so the predators were more likely to be able to find them. Well, these near 24-hour rhythms are a result of things that are going on within individual cells. There are a series of transcriptional translational feedback loops that generate these 24-hour rhythms. And you'll hear, I'm not going to go into any of these details because I think you'll hear a little bit more about that from some of the other speakers. In mammals, we know that there's a master pacemaker in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN. Early on, recordings of multi-unit electrical activity showed that there was very rhythmic electrical activity in the SCN, and then subsequent studies have shown that that's actually a property of individual SCN cells, that you can see near 24-hour rhythms in electrical activity in those cells. And here is a slice of a human brain where you can see the SCN sitting just above the optic chiasm at the base of the third ventricle. In addition, so this central clock then sends out signals to the body to help coordinate the activities of the different parts of the body. It sends out both hormonal signals like melatonin or cortisol, and also sends signals through the autonomic nervous system. And then in addition to those signals coming from the central clock, some of the cells and tissues and organs also receive timing feedback from behaviors. So from things like temperature, from activity, and from the presence of glucose due to feeding. Gene expression is circadian patterns of gene expression are really widespread in the organism. And I'm just going to tell you about two really nice studies done by the group of John Hoganesh over the past few years. This first one was done in mice. And what they did is they looked at about 20,000 protein coding genes and looked at them in a variety of different tissues. And looked to see which of those genes were rhythmically expressed in those different tissues. And what they found is that the number of rhythmically expressed protein coding genes varied a lot from one tissue to the next. So the liver had the most, about 16% of the genes were rhythmically expressed in the liver, whereas in the brain it was only about 3 or 4%. But every tissue that they looked in had some genes that were rhythmically expressed. And of the genes that they looked at, 43% were rhythmic in at least one of the organs that they looked at. And 10 of them were rhythmic in every organ that they looked at. When they repeated a similar study in humans a couple of years later, here they looked at about 17,000 different genes. And one of the interesting things that they found, and I think what's going to be one of the most important things as the circadian field moves forward, is that of these 17,000 genes, about 7,500 of them were rhythmically expressed. And of those, about 1,000 of them were involved in some ways as either drug targets, drug transporters, or metabolizing enzymes for drugs that are actually on the market. And so what this implies is that for short-acting drugs, at least, if we knew the ideal time of day to give those drugs, we could potentially give a lower dose of those drugs. We could give them at a time of day when they produce fewer side effects. And we could potentially get much more efficacy out of those short-acting drugs. But right now, of course, drugs aren't typically tested at different times of day. But we do know, for example, that there are some blood pressure medications that have been shown to give better control of blood pressure if they're given in the evening as opposed to being given in the morning, for example. So this is an area where I think precision medicine and personalized medicine can really move things forward in the future. Now, one of the things about the circadian timing system is it's circadian, so approximately 24 hours, but not exactly 24 hours. And there's a range within each species. In humans, we find the range is about an hour, from about 23 and a half hours to about 24 and a half hours. And this is just showing in a series of individuals who were studied in specialized conditions in our lab, what those individual differences in period look like. So each symbol represents a different individual. They were studied for 2 weeks in the lab, and we looked at, in this case, the timing of the onset of melatonin secretion each day over those 2 weeks. I started everybody out here at 0 and then followed them over the course of the 2 weeks. You can see that only this one individual here is very close to 24 hours. So if someone with a 24-hour period, there should be a vertical line here. But as we find in larger groups of people, on average, the period is longer than 24 hours. It averages 24.2 hours in healthy sighted individuals. But you do find some individuals with periods that are shorter than 24 hours. And whether an individual has a shorter or longer than 24-hour period will predispose them to certain types of sleep disorders. And it will require them to reset their clock by different amounts each day. So in order to stay synchronized to the local environment, these near 24-hour rhythms have to be reset regularly. And the further you are away from 24.0, the bigger the resetting that has to happen. So now I'm going to jump to the circadian influence on sleep and how we actually go about quantifying that. So one of the things that you're probably aware of is that if you stay awake all day and then all night, you're going to be much more likely to fall asleep accidentally after those first 16 hours. But if we look at some other cognitive functions, one of the interesting things that we see is that, for example, in subjective sleepiness, across a normal 16-hour day, which would be up to this dotted line, you see sleepiness is fairly sleepiness is fairly low and stable, but then throughout the night it rises dramatically, but then it kind of levels off the next morning. And you see something similar with the speed of processing information. It's fairly stable and high throughout the 16-hour day. It drops throughout the night, then rebounds again the next morning. And we see this in other cognitive functions as well. So this next morning rebound is happening due to the input of the circadian system. So these things aren't continuing to get worse, but they show these rhythmic changes that are due to the interaction of the sleep-wake homeostat, so being awake longer and longer, and then this rhythmic drive from the circadian system for sleep and wakefulness. And to really separate those things and tease them apart and see what the independent contributions are, we use really specialized inpatient laboratory studies. And the protocol that we use looks like this. It's called a forced asynchrony protocol. And what we do is bring someone into the lab and schedule them to live on a day length that's very far away from 24 hours. In this case, this individual is scheduled to live on a 28-hour day. These horizontal bars are the scheduled sleep opportunities, and you see they start 4 hours later each day than the previous day. The individual lives in dim lighting, and the circadian system can't synchronize or entrain to that schedule. And so it begins to just free run and follow its own period length, which is shown by this dashed line here. So by collecting temperature and melatonin data throughout this time, we can then use mathematical programs that account for the 24-hour periodicity and then search for the circadian periodicity. And in this individual, it happened to be 24 hours and 17 minutes. And then knowing that, we can look at either sleep or things that are done while performance tests while the person is awake, and say what circadian time did that epoch of sleep happen at, or what circadian time did that performance test happen at, and look at what the circadian influence is. And we can also look within the scheduled day and say, okay, if we average together the sleep that happens at the beginning of each sleep episode, what does that look like? And so in that way, we can we can eliminate one of those systems and then just look at the variation due to the other one. So this is how what it looks like when we separate the circadian from the sleep-dependent aspects of sleep. One of the things that you'll see is that some things have a very strong circadian component, like REM sleep, whereas other things don't have a very strong circadian component, but have a very strong sleep-dependent component. So we can separate those two things and quantify them, and then later see how they interact. And here you can see how these two things interact to regulate your ability to stay asleep. So this is wakefulness within scheduled sleep opportunities. This is the first 20% of the night, second, third, fourth, and final 20% of the night. And what you can see is at the beginning of the night, there's very little wakefulness and there's very little circadian variability. And that's because the individual's been awake for a long time ahead of time. They have a lot of built-up sleep pressure from their sleep-wake homeostat. And so that allows them to fall asleep and stay asleep, at least at the beginning of the night. But then as that sleep pressure starts to be dissipated, you can see that there's more and more wakefulness as you go further and further into the sleep episode. And now you start to see this strong circadian rhythm of sleep-wake propensity coming out. And by the end of a scheduled night, you can see that while there are some times within the circadian cycle where you can stay asleep, there are other times where if the end of your sleep opportunity is happening there, you're going to have a lot of trouble staying asleep. And if we combine those two figures into this three-dimensional graph, one of the things that you can see with this dashed line here is this is where healthy young adults typically have their sleep episode placed. So they go to sleep at approximately this circadian phase, and then as they're sleeping, of course, their circadian phase is changing, but they're sleeping in this valley here where they can actually stay asleep for an extended period of time. Now, in contrast, one of the things that shift workers do is they get off work and go home and initiate sleep around here, and then you can see, so they can fall asleep okay because they've been awake all night, but then you can see that they're facing this large mountain of wake drive from the circadian system, and we think that that's why shift workers have significantly shorter sleep than day workers do. So the sleep-wake homeostat allows you to fall asleep at the end of the day because you've been awake for a long time and you've built up sleep pressure. And what the circadian timing system does is allow you to remain asleep at the end of the night so that you can have a long and consolidated sleep episode. We can do a similar thing with waking functions. So I'm going to quickly skip through some of these in the interest of time. And so here, again, we've separated the circadian from the wake-dependent aspects of a number of different things, including calculation performance and short-term memory and subjective alertness. And those things interact. And again, if we look at a three-dimensional graph, this is where a healthy young adult would normally have their wake episode. And it's in sort of this region here where you can maintain a fairly high and stable level of performance across an extended 16 or 18-hour wake episode. Whereas if you woke up closer to here and then were trying to stay awake during the nighttime, your performance would definitely suffer from that. So it's the interaction of these, the process S, the sleep-wake homeostat, and the wake and sleep drives coming from the circadian system that allow us to maintain this very stable and high level of alertness and performance across an extended 16 or 18-hour waking day. And you can see that those things decline if you stay up all night, but then if you continue to stay up, you'll see them rebound and again be stable, although at a lower level on the next day. So I'm going to skip over this one and just quickly talk a little bit about some of the implications of this for shift workers. So somewhere between 7 and 12 million Americans work at night. This is actually a growing segment of the workforce because in a lot of industries that didn't used to have shift work, they now do. So retail, food service, those kind of things where you can now go grocery shopping in the middle of the night, whereas in the past you weren't able to. Those all require workers. And there are a lot of adverse safety and productivity consequences of that because these workers are trying to remain awake when their circadian system is promoting sleep, and they then go home and try to sleep during the daytime when the circadian system is promoting wakefulness. We also know that there are some adverse health, long-term health consequences of this as well. So why is this a problem? As I mentioned earlier, it's because shift workers don't sleep as long as day workers because of this circadian drive for wakefulness during the daytime. And these are just data from a simulated shift work study showing that on the first 3 nights of shift work, these individuals are only getting somewhere between 3 and 5 hours of sleep as opposed to between 6 and 7 hours before the simulated shift work. Shift workers also suffer from the fact that they're not getting enough recovery sleep, and then they're trying to stay awake when their circadian system is trying to promote sleep. And again, they have a lot of performance decrements. These are lapses of attention that occur on the first 3 nights of shift work in the simulated shift work study. And one of the things that we know is that most shift workers don't adapt to working night shifts. So here are data, again, from a laboratory study of shift work, where we looked at some physiologic rhythms and some performance rhythms, and the before and after curves look exactly the same. So these individuals didn't adapt at all, despite having worked a week of night work. We know that placing the sleep in the wrong place not only causes performance decrements and problems with sleep, but it causes problems with underlying regulation of these circadian-driven transcripts, where moving sleep, this is normal sleep and wakefulness. You can see that some of these transcripts are low at night and high during the day, and some do the opposite. When the same individual participants had sleep displaced by 12 hours, you can see that there's a lot of disruption of both night peaking and day peaking transcripts. And we think that one of the reasons that shift workers don't adapt is that when they're commuting home in the morning, they're getting outdoor light exposure, which is generally way stronger than any indoor light exposure that you get, reinforcing the fact that it's daytime to the circadian system. And then even permanent night shift workers don't stay on the same schedule when they have days off. They try to sleep at night and be awake during the day so they can spend time with family and friends. So to just wrap things up, human sleep and wakefulness are co-regulated by these two interacting physiological processes. The circadian system regulates cycles of sleepiness and alertness, as well as physiological functions, and it orients us to be a day active and night sleep species. And because of that, our 24/7 modern life has negative impacts on our sleep duration and on the regulation of our circadian rhythmicity, leading to adverse health and safety consequences, as well as some circadian rhythm sleep disorders. But we can harness this knowledge, and that provides a lot of potential for personalized medicine. So just before I stop, I'd just like to acknowledge the support that contributed to a lot of these studies, my colleagues and trainees, and this is my current research group. Thank you.
Questions? I think maybe in the second row here in the middle. Mm-hmm. Sorry, can't read that.
Hi. Do you know amongst the shift workers, was there any change or potential activation to the dim light melatonin secretion onset at all?
So generally, if you look at a group of shift workers, it moves only by a few minutes, but some individuals move a lot, others don't move very much, and they move in opposite directions. So some are moving in an adaptive direction and some are moving in a maladaptive direction. But the most that we see, unless we're specifically trying to manipulate that by particular light-dark exposure, the most we see is things moving by an hour or two, so not by enough that would allow them to be adapted to that.
So was your implication is if the shift workers were protected from other resetting influences, they could actually adapt to shift work, that the activity pattern itself would reset their clock?
Yes, and so that has been shown in some very unique shift work situations. So for example, on offshore oil rigs, the workers go out there generally for 2 weeks solid, and they work every day for 2 weeks, often either 12-hour days or 12-hour nights. Those individuals do start to adapt by the end of that because they're working every day of the week, and when they have time off, there's not much for them to do, and they tend to stay inside, so not getting a lot of outdoor light exposure. Yeah.
I have one maybe. Sure. So are there any epidemiological studies tracking shift workers or people of lifestyle leads them to these disrupted schedules and whether they're more impacted by disease?
Yeah, so there are a lot of epidemiologic studies showing that people who have done shift work have more cardiovascular disease, more metabolic problems, higher rates of certain kinds of cancers, and that those things, that the longer you do shift work, the more likely you are to suffer from some of those consequences. So yeah, there is evidence for that.
I know there is evidence in rodents that food and social activity can also reset the clock. Do you know if that works in humans and can that help?
So that hasn't really been well tested in humans. We suspect that it might have an impact. One area where you might think about that is in people who are totally blind. So people who are totally blind, some of them have cyclic sleep disorders, as if their circadian system isn't synchronized to the external world because they're not getting light-dark exposure, which is the strongest synchronizer. But some of them are able to stay synchronized. And so we think in those individuals, they may have a period that's closer to 24 hours that maybe can use some of those behaviors to keep them synchronized. But it hasn't really been well tested or teased apart.